Hey guys, it's Lou. I'm back again for another video. This video is a contest entry for Vinylizer, John out in England. John's reached 200 subs. Congratulations, John. I really like watching your channel. His channel is called Vinylizer, and for those of you who don't know John's channel, he shows mainly metal, but he also shows a lot of other hard rock and different types of music, but metal is his main thing. And John, I really like your channel. I like the amount of videos that you make. Typically there's a few videos per day of John showing different things. Sometimes he's showing the shirts that he's received, you know, Whitesnake, Megadeth, Metallica, that sort of thing. And sometimes he's showing his favorite albums of the 70s, a bunch of different things. So John, really like your channel. Keep it up. And for those of you who don't know his channel, go over there and check it out. So his contest is for him reaching 200 subs, and it's called Musical Family Tree. So he wanted us to pick one album, and then the members of the group on that album to then show other albums that each of those members have been a part of. So the album that I chose, and I've shown this album before, is King Crimson's album Discipline. The lineup, King Crimson has gone through various lineups, but the lineup on this particular album in the early 80s, this is from 1981, the lineup included Adrian Belew on guitar and vocals, Bill Bruford on drums, Tony Levin on bass and stick, and of course Robert Fripp on guitars. Okay, so that's the parent album. Adrian Belew. Adrian Belew, I'm showing, he had a couple of solo albums in the early 80s at the time that he was in King Crimson. This one is The Lone Rhino. Pretty decent solo album, not his greatest work. I think he had better solo albums, which I don't have on vinyl, that came in the late 80s, early 90s. I think his solo albums in that period were much stronger. I think he was saving some of his strong songs that he came up with for the King Crimson albums. Another solo album in the early 80s for Adrian Belew, Twang Bar King. It's a decent album. It's I'd say this and Lone Rhino are pretty good albums, but I definitely recommend instead, and you might have to get those on CD, his Inner Revolutions, Young Lions albums, those type of albums. Here was another good album that he made. Adrian Belew also was part of Talking Heads and this live album, which is a live album that shows earlier Talking Heads stuff from 77 to 79, and Adrian Belew appears on the 80 and 81 portions of this album, contributed backing vocals and also wonderful guitar sounds on this album that are easily, like when you're hearing this album, you can easily identify Adrian Belew's guitar on this. So Talking Heads, and this is a double live album. The name of the band is Talking Heads. The next member of that King Crimson Discipline lineup that I'm showing is Bill Bruford. Bill Bruford, of course, was part of King Crimson back in the early to mid 70s, but before joining King Crimson, Bill Bruford was part of Yes, and was part of this album called the Yes album. He was also there for Fragile and Closer to the Edge, and some albums previous to that, but those are the three. That trilogy of albums is probably Yes's strongest work and most essential work. So Bill Bruford. Bill Bruford, as I mentioned before, was part of the earlier lineup of King Crimson back from 73 to 74, and one album that he was featured on is Starless and the Bible Black. This album came again in a trilogy of albums that King Crimson released in the early 70s, which in my opinion was their strongest work. That trilogy began with Lark's Tongue and Aspic, then this album, Starless and the Bible Black, and then the album Red. And then there was a live album called USA after that. This album includes a lot of improvisational type stuff, which I think Bill Bruford, given some of his jazz chops, really excelled at. Bill Bruford was also part of a live Genesis touring lineup, and was part of this album called Seconds Out. This album is Phil Collins' first live album with Phil Collins at lead vocals, and you can see Bill Bruford right over here wearing his Boston Bruins shirt, which he wore quite a few times. Seconds Out, I believe, was for the Trick of the Tail tour, which was the first album with, again, Phil Collins on lead vocals, and they did, this was a combination of Gabriel stuff and also songs from Trick of the Tail, so it has a good mixture of stuff, quite a good live album. And then after that, Bill Bruford released some albums under his own name. This was sort of a jazz fusion type album. One of a Kind, yeah, and Alan Holdsworth is on guitar on this album as well. He also was part of the band UK, which was formed with John Wetton, who was in the earlier version of King Crimson as well. I don't have a copy of that album. That's definitely something I'd like to get, the first UK album. The next member of the Discipline era King Crimson lineup is Tony Levin. Tony Levin played bass on the first Peter Gabriel solo album. I think some people also refer to this as Water because of the cover. Coincidentally, Robert Fripp is also on this album, but I've got some other albums to show for him. So Tony Levin playing bass on this Peter Gabriel album, and as well, Tony Levin played bass on this live Peter Gabriel Plays Live album, which was for the Security tour in the 80s. And last but not least, probably the most well-known member of King Crimson, Robert Fripp. Robert Fripp, I think everybody knows, played guitar on Heroes, the song Heroes from this album, the self-titled track. Everybody knows about this album. Don't need to say much about that. This was from 1977. Robert Fripp then released his first, and I believe only solo album, Exposure, in 1979. This album is known for its array of guest vocalists. Daryl Hall appeared on a couple of tracks, Peter Hamill on a few tracks, and Peter Gabriel as well on a very cool version of Here Comes the Flood from this album, which also appeared in a different version on Peter Gabriel's first album that I showed before. So Robert Fripp, Exposure. This is a decent album. I don't reach for this album very often. When I'm in the mood for Robert Fripp, I tend to go for the classic King Crimson stuff, In the Court, the Wetton era stuff, or the early 80s albums, Discipline, Three of a Perfect Pair, those albums. But this is a decent album. There are some King Crimson sounding moments on this album, definitely, as you would expect. But it's a pretty good record. As well, Robert Fripp, that album was from 79. In 1982, I believe, he made his first album in a duo with Andy Summers, a guitarist of The Police. That was called I Advance Masked. And then their second album together in 1984 is called Bewitched. Robert Fripp took more of a backseat role on this album. This was more of an Andy Summers record. But again, Robert Fripp did play on this, and it's credited to both of them. This album has some interesting guitar textures. I think what lets this album down is the drum machine sounds, which I'm not too fond of. As well, Robert Fripp also played on this 1986 album, credited to the former Japan lead singer, David Sylvian. This is called Gone to Earth. This is from 1986. This is a double album. First record on this has, you know, proper songs with vocals, etc. The second record is all instrumental. This is excellent, and you can really hear Robert Fripp's influence on this. This eventually led to an album in the early 90s under David Sylvian and Robert Fripp's names together, and they toured that album. And that tour actually had two members that went eventually to be part of a future King Crimson lineup in 1995. It had Pat Mastelotto and Trey Gunn. Pat Mastelotto on drums and Trey Gunn on bass and stick when King Crimson reformed in 1995 and had their double trio, two bassists, two drummers, two guitarists. So that's it. The four members of King Crimson from the Discipline era and their associated projects that they participated in. Again, John, congratulations on the 200 subs, and everybody else, let me know your comments on these albums that I've shown, and go over there and check out John's channel. Thanks a lot, guys.